Howdy, Tyler. Howdy, TJ.
Hey guys.
Hello.
Sorry, Tyler. Looks like you had a full mouth.
Even doesn't.
Yeah, that's
Tyler is
I know that
eating.
violates podcast rule number 1.
Well, we are here for another, let's see, this is our fourth Kinship Lab recording. And today we agreed to talk about maybe TJ's most favorite topic, celibate partnerships.
Is
it?
it?
I think, covenant brotherhood, celibate partnerships, kinship, all that good stuff.
I do like that.
It's
I
up
do like,
there.
I
It's
do
definitely
like that
up there.
than I. It's definitely up there.
And this is I think it's been on our horizons, but Pieter Valk just revised his article I guess last month now. So I think that will provide some good fodder for our discussion. Okay, well, thank you. So many things being worked out in this Kinship Lab. Anyways, but also I think maybe this is a fun time. We just came from Revoice, where we had a grand old time.
That's right.
And included in there was affinity groups during different lunches, and I had a communitarian, people interested in or practicing local community life, household community life together, and there were 11 of us over there. But then across the room was those who are interested in committed friendships, spiritual friendships, covenant brotherhood, celibate partnerships, or discerning, and all these different things. And there were a whole bunch of people over there. And were you leading that discussion or someone else?
I led many of those.
You were co-leading some of those discussions. Anyways,
I was
there was a big group over there, which I feel like has been an expanding, actually maybe even flipped numbers. Last year at Revoice, there were maybe 20 people in the community one. And I guess I don't remember how many in celibate partnerships and covenant siblings. Anyways, it's a hot topic. People are interested in it. Is this side B dating, side B romance? What is all this stuff that we're talking about celibate partnerships?
Toss in very briefly that what we hope to accomplish with this particular Kinship Lab is just to offer reflections on this particular engagement from Pieter Valk with celibate partnerships. At some point, I think it could potentially be helpful to maybe have Pieter on the podcast to talk about the development of his thought on celibate partnerships. Because the first version of his article was a kind of rejection of celibate partnerships as too risky, and as unwise in a world in which celibate Christians or gay Christians could pursue committed communities, build their own monasteries like he was trying to do with the Nashville Family of Brothers, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I wanted to just our reflections on this particular engagement with celibate partnerships, just because I think across the Side B movement, this is one of the rare writings that I've seen on celibate partnership. And there's still a lot more work to be done in sort of examining celibate partnership within the Side B movement. But yeah, we really appreciate, I'll speak for myself. I really appreciate that he wrote about celibate partnerships in the first place, because that gives us fodder for conversation, feed for fodder.
And he specifically names in this, so he originally wrote it in January 2023.
Yeah.
Hit the Scene was, primarily a critique of celibate partnerships. In this revised version, he has dialogued with a lot more people, and so he's grateful for Greg Coles from Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, Eve Tushnet from Catholic Futures, Josh Proctor from Holy Ourselves, Timon Lee, the New Kinship podcast, Aaron Taylor, and others who helped clarify this conversation. So I'm grateful for Pieter's desire to be more intentional about bringing more communicators or collaborators into this kind of thought project, because we're trying as Tyler said, yeah, we're trying to build the conversation here, and we hope that our contribution here is continued towards that goal. I know that personally, I used to be very suspect of celibate partnerships, and was kind of probably had a similar sentiment as Pieter Valk of just like, why do you need partnerships? Can't we all just party in community? It's so much more fun. Don't have to deal with all this weird kind of like potential pseudo romance stuff or confusion. But I think also my experience in intentional Christian community has seen just the large variety of way that Christians can build households, and there's not like a biblical mandate for how many people live in one house, how many adults or children, etc. As well as the wide variety of personality types that I've lived with, and how there are certain people's brains, even like just their kind of neuro setup that makes certain forms of household or community life more or less difficult in certain ways, and that it's kind of presumptuous for me to think that like the size of household, the number of partnerships I'm dealing with on a daily basis in community is what would lead to the best flourishing for everybody else too.
I was going to say that I actually ended up being mostly critical of this. I am happy that there was a development of more openness. I'm happy that Pieter tried to be more open about this change, try to tell people like, hey, my position has grown or evolved or changed somehow, and being willing to share that publicly. But I still find myself, again, critical. I don't think this moves the bar actually that much in helping the conversation.
Well, let's get into it and start with his current definition. Quote, by celibate partnership, I mean committed companionship between two Christians who tend to abstain from sex. And then he goes through kind of like some of these. Sorry, I clicked the button again and it brought me to the footnote. Some celibate partnerships are exclusive and lifelong. Others are more temporary. Some use dating language. Others avoid it. Some are emotionally and physically romantic. Some are not. Some involve mutual attraction. Others do not. While these partnerships don't consider themselves to be married in the eyes of God, some are open to things like civil unions in the government for financial and legal benefits, or civil marriages. Some celibate partnerships share a home, while others live 100 miles away. So even when two people talk about celibate partnerships, they may not be talking about the same thing. That's Pieter Valk, just on the very surface. I'm like, all my different types of partnerships are celibate because I'm not sleeping with my housemates, my ministry partners, blah, blah, blah. But obviously that's not what we're actually talking about.
But I think this definition is not helpful and too minimalistic, because it covers committed companionship between two Christians who abstain from sex is an incredibly broad definition, which most forms of committed same-sex love that I can think of would
I mean, and in that case, like my housemates, we're like, we have there's a companionship that we share in this covenant life and community together, and we're not having sex.
Also, my covenant brotherhood, which I would not, it's similar to this. I wouldn't define like this. It is committed companionship between two Christians who intend to abstain from sex, but it's more than that. But it also could be a summary definition. Even committed friendship, that could be a summary definition. I also... Yeah,
maybe his word companionship might be trying to capture what you try to capture, and what I hear you say of like main life partner.
Yeah, but I always say like my covenant brothers are also my life partners. They're just not my main life partners. So I don't know. One of the early problems I had with this article was this definition, though I don't remember where he came from in his prior article, or so I don't remember his definition then.
Yeah, could we maybe?
Your definition is, you would say, celibate partnership is not just committed companionship, but a committed relationship for someone to be your main life partner.
A main life partner that is intended to be celibate and is focused on a common building up of a household or a common mission. Yeah. And I'd probably throw the word exclusive in too.
Nice.
So, but he did not like that. But I would probably throw the word exclusive into it trying to communicate that celibate partnership, the way they're currently developing, and the way I'm pro their development, is that they have higher levels of exclusivity compared to other types of these broad under umbrella, like these types of love, these types of kinship or love. So yeah, that's kind of a bricolage of definitions, but his definition basically, I thought it was too minimalistic to be helpful. Yeah.
Do you feel equipped to give an arc of what his argument here is in this revision?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Basically, so he defines celibate partnership, as we said, that committed companionship between two Christians who intend to abstain from sex. He notes, as we mentioned also, that in the current, I think this was from Greg Cole's work, the current way that the term is being used, there's lots of different permutations. And that's part of this thing. But he's trying to then talk about how celibacy can still involve intimacy and connection. And that's part of sexuality. And many Christians talk about vocational singleness as if it's the call to be lonely for the gospel. Here's the start of one paragraph. And there's a recognition that he thinks from Jesus, Paul, the scriptures, that their celibates need human intimacy in family in some way, right? And he's talking about how the early church experimented with a variety of types of this, or like forms of intimacy for celibates that can allow us to have ideas and lessons. And then he jumps to, I think his key point in my read of the thing, that we need to compare celibate partnerships to what they are now to this idea of spiritual betrothals, which is called what is it? Synexic? I don't know how to say it actually.
I think it's synesactism, something like that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. And then there is a line of interpretation of 1 Corinthians 7:36-38, which understands Paul to be talking about this sort of idea of spiritual betrothal between two people. We might call it Josephite marriage, or two people who intend to marry, a male and a woman who intend to marry but not be sexually involved in the marriage, but intend to have like a spiritual friendship, you might say.
Yeah, actually, can I pause you there super quick?
And then
I wanted to highlight for our listeners, I actually think there's a significant difference between Josephite marriage and spiritual betrothal. So a spiritual betrothal is between two celibate people who are sort of just deciding to share a household with each other. A Josephite marriage is a marriage, like an official Catholic marriage, between two people who choose not to have sex with one another. And the key difference between those two things is that in the spiritual betrothal, the two people are not married. So if they have sex with one another, that's fornication. But in a Josephite marriage, if the two people have sex with one another, then they're just doing what married people do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a great clarification. So he talks about that and how eventually these forms of spiritual betrothals were replaced by a form of monasticism. And then the church, or I think it means the Western church especially, moved to forbid the betrothals as these other types, as the spiritual betrothals were seen as more questionable or more likely to fail than these other types of or I don't know if spiritual betrothals is exactly monasticism, but these monastic systems which developed seem to be safer to some interpreters of the systems. And he thinks that he says this logic around this movement between moving from this type of spiritual betrothal to this type of monasticism, which was seen as safer, he said that logic shaped his early argument. If gay celibate Christians today can reasonably find committed, lived-in, intentional Christian communities, then celibate partnerships may be unnecessarily risky. But are they? Is the relational climate in the church in the United States today more similar to the first century church or the formal monastic monasteries when they dominated in like the 5th century and beyond for the church? And basically, this is his next major point. After spiritual betrothals is like the key kinship tradition he tries to revolve around, was intentional communities basically aren't working enough or aren't strong enough. So because this is not happening, it might make sense for these what we call celibate partnerships to emerge as forms of community for Christians. And then he goes through a thing where he talks about objections to celibate partnerships and dating romance, which I think that requires more like in-depth engagement. But I think that's the basic argument. And for some gay celibate Christians, celibate partnerships may be the most viable form of companionship needed, which they need because of this need for family, community, households, etc. Yeah, is the same? Anything else that was a big
I might
point?
just
Please
just
share.
add one more thing, which I think is representative of maybe how TJ, how maybe us as a podcast. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to hear you guys' opinions, but like how our conception of celibate partnership might be different from Peter's. But it seems to me that Peter longs for a day where church community and monastic models and lived in communities and so forth are so strong that celibate partnership is no longer necessary. And I think that we see celibate partnership potentially as a like positive vocation of same-sex love that actually might add to a vibrant tapestry of rich community in the body of Christ. So such that it's not that like the development of rich community in the body of Christ would negate the need for celibate partnership, but actually that celibate partnership might be a part of a vibrant tapestry of different models of kinship and community that might exist in the broader body of Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. And that's especially because my primary way of understanding celibate partnership is kind of through this tradition of covenant brotherhood, like we see in David and Jonathan, and other examples in the scriptures in Christian history. And I really do, commend Peter's overall vision for, like, at the beginning when he's talking about, like, being celibate doesn't mean you're supposed to be lonely. Just read the scriptures. Look at, like, how celibacy is talked about in Matthew 19. Look at what Jesus says in Luke 18. Look at other parts of the scriptures where there's a promise that as you follow Jesus, that you are brought into this, rich, expansive kingdom that is going to be way bigger than just like the little households and families that we build by human hands. You're brought into the life and family of the church, and that is meant to be a rich place of belonging, of which covenant siblinghood, committed friendships, spiritual friendships, celibate partnerships are, as you said, Tyler, part of that tapestry of rich love, and that each of these relationships, while they might have, I can only commit so much to so many households in my life, there's an exclusivity to my like seed house covenant. That doesn't mean that like the love that's cultivated here in seed house is just for seed house. It's for the good of the neighborhood. It's good for the good of those visiting us. It's for the good of us supporting each other in mission to the world and to supporting other communities even outside of us. And so similarly, I think one thing I liked about what you said, TJ, of that the celibate partnership has that shared commitment towards building a household or pursuing a similar mission, that all of the things that we do as Christians, like when there is deep love cultivated, that as long as it's like love in the spirit, then it's generative for the kingdom, like it's fruitful for the kingdom. It's not a self-centered love.
I wanted to, maybe I could just note very briefly, like 5 things that I liked about the article, and then we can move into aspects of critique, if that, because I do want to be fair. I love to kind of cultivate like fair dialogue.
Yeah, of course.
So
Thank you so much, Tyler.
I've tried to name some of those things, so I'm hoping you'll repeat them and I'll say yes and amen.
That's right. Yeah. So I think David Frank, you already noted that we like how he notes that celibacy is not a call to loneliness or aloneness.
Hallelujah.
That's right. That's right. And we totally agree with that. Like the scripture itself doesn't think that celibacy is a call to loneliness or aloneness. I really like the serious consideration of romance idolatry, and I do think it makes a lot of sense to be able to conceive of a way of approaching celibate partnership that doesn't just reify the romance idolatry that we see in the straight world already, right? Or like just
Yeah,
in
true,
modern
true.
Western culture, generally speaking. So I think that Peter is kind of aware
Mhm.
of the risks of just recreating romance idolatry just in this queer way. I think a third thing I like is I like that there is an attempt to analyze how spiritual betrothals might relate to the question of celibate partnerships, because I have seen inside Y spaces, in Gospel Coalition articles, in other kind of responses to certain posts that were on the Spiritual Friendship blog, that side Y people, or like people in the reform world, or like people in more conservative church environments, generally speaking, are drawing comparisons between spiritual betrothal and celibate partnership. And it's important to be able to pay attention to that comparison so that we can like respond to whether we think that that is a good model for understanding celibate partnership or a poor model for understanding celibate partnership. And so I think that that adds to the conversation. I liked that there is like a serious consideration of essentially, like, it almost feels like there's a kind of free for all in the straight world as it regards romance. Like, romance is sort of almost unscrutinized in the straight world. There's this kind of assumption that, oh, because it's happening between a man and a woman, like, have at it, date as many people as you want. Like, romance is fun, go have fun, that kind of thing. Whereas for queer celibates, that approach to romance is far more scrutinized. And so there's a kind of unfairness that's developed when we allow a free-for-all for straight folks as they lean into romance, and just like a carte blanche forbidding of romance among queer celibates. I do have some questions about what dating or romance are even supposed to point to. So I do, that strength has a kind of asterisk to it. But at the very least, I do appreciate that he's pointing out a kind of unfairness between how straight Christians treat romance and dating and how they treat the same topics for queer Christians. And then the last thing I'll note is I really appreciate that he takes seriously the risks of celibate partnership and the importance of careful discernment with regard to entering into those kinds of relationships. I think those are all points that we can all agree on here on the podcast.
Can I add a sixth?
Yeah,
Yeah. Go
definitely.
ahead, David.
So one thing I enjoyed in reading this, Peter's a good writer, a thoughtful thinker, and just the fact that he's inviting people into ethical considerations of accommodationalism, I thought was really, really great. Even if I think that this specific argument, maybe like isn't necessary for this, that inviting readers, inviting the church into recognizing that Christian ethics aren't so simple as just like the Bible says to do XYZ, and you either do it or you don't. That there's just a lot of area of life where it's more complicated, like just that method of ethical evaluation is something that we as a church need to grow in maturity. I think there's a lot of church leaders that skirt around the real like wisdom and nuance that's needed to make ethical judgments in situations. And they try to just go for like eternal judgments of, approval or condemnation and try to just live out of those. So I see this article as contributing to a more mature way of approaching the world and the life of a Christian. So that's my 6th point.
May I lead a list of critiques after that list of strengths that I think we all agree upon?
Sure.
okay?
Unleash the floodgates, TJ.
Thank you. I'm coming. I'm about to share some thoughts. As we mentioned before, we talked about this. I think there's a key meta reflective or meta theoretical claim that he's making where he says essentially celibate partnerships are a temporary accommodation towards just an issue of these monastic structures not being as prevalent or as common or as powerful. We've already talked about this. I think that's like a major failing because I would argue an alternative perspective that, as we mentioned, as part of this rich tapestry of Christian forms of kinship, that, well, a minor one is one that is viable. I also think in my opinion, his whole document relies on just one strand of Christian influenced kinship, which is the spiritual betrothal as the key model for celibate partnership. But he doesn't engage other histories of Christian types of kinship, like covenant brotherhood we mentioned, spiritual friendship among monastics, or you might even say kind of small monastic, like 2 or 3 monastics who live together. And these are other types of Christian kinship, traditions of Christian kinship that, at least in the contemporary discourse I'm aware of on celibate partnerships, is part of the conversation. Spiritual betrothal actually is a fairly minor part of the conversation among the people that I talk with regularly on this. So it's interesting that he brings it up because it's not it's less prominent of how any sort of conversation I have had with engage this question. He also, in the end, in the footnotes, he basically comes straight out, if he hasn't said it already, in response to a commenter who was critical. He says he's only cautioning against celibate partnerships that are romantic and exclusive, as inconsistent with the biblical concept of spiritual friendship, closely resembling a practice that is forbidden by the early church, and not celibate in the way that Christians have consistently used that word. There's a lot of claims there in that phrase, but this is still revolving around these gaps or these misunderstandings of romantic and exclusive, as if that was a problem. And I think he kind of provides a definition of romantic in footnote 14, but I think it's not a really helpful definition. It just means something distinct from sexual activity and ordinary friendship. It's not perfectly clear, blah, 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 blah. But I mean, I do use romantic occasionally with a sort of sorrowful spirit, where I think a lot of the work, people who talk about these things in contemporary times in the Side B movement, we usually talk about moving beyond romance as the key category that we're using, and probably a need for better definitions and categories. But he still really bases his work on romance, as I assume the common English word.
TJ, were you
So I think
noting that from because all the comments were from his 2023 article? Was that a footnote?
Oh, you sure?
Yeah, all the comments are from 2023.
Oh, I didn't see that. No, okay, sorry.
Um,
And I guess maybe he's changed. Let me see if he changed in the article.
his in a kind of side conversation, he said to me that he's basically trying to create accommodation for pastors to help Side B people discern, like, basically how to have romantic friendships, in the sense that there's this like, oh, do we have chemistry? Would we be good housemates? Would we be good like life partners and be able to support each other in our following Christ and living celibate lives for the kingdom? So he's, I think, in that way, I think, shifting towards at the very least an accommodation or openness to a type of Side B romance.
Okay, so I guess I'll retract that argument then if that is the case. Maybe he's being more carefully thoughtful on that. So I retract that critique. I have to say,
well, I think the part of your critique that he's still mainly using spiritual betrothals to argue for that accommodation.
Well, that one is a different critique.
Okay,
I'm now on this critique of like romance is
go ahead.
not a very helpful category, which perhaps he's changing on that. I still think we need new categories, and I don't think that was as clear here in this document. I would also say, I know he obviously mentions in the top very few he's engaged, and I don't know if he's read things, but I still feel like in this document it lacks much evidence or much experience. Like I don't see like what I know from the contemporary discourse of like Side B people talking about this relationship appearing that much. And yeah. So I think you need more of an evidence base to make some of these claims. Though I'm a social scientist, so I love a good evidence base in a way that sometimes literary scholars have more. Yeah, go
Can
ahead.
I clarify what you mean by a lack of evidence or experience? Are you saying that it feels to you like Peter hasn't heard enough stories or hasn't seen enough quantitative or qualitative data with regard to people who are currently in celibate partnerships, or people whose celibate partnerships have failed, or people whose celibate partnerships have succeeded over the course of 10, 15, 20 years?
When I read this, it seems like, well, first of all, I think he's lacking, I think, in historical data for talking about these other types of kinship that are relevant to the contemporary conversation. Though, of course, he may think his example is the most relevant. So I think there is that lack of literature comparing other models of kinship.
And you mean other models of
Um,
kinship besides spiritual betrothal?
yes, that are relevant to contemporary conversations around celibate
Okay.
partnership. And that, like I said, that includes covenant siblinghood, includes spiritual friendship among monastics. It might include these small groups of monastics who live together, like one, two, or three monastics. Things like that. I don't hear stories much. Um, his article just doesn't sound like, this is kind of arbitrary, but I was arbitrary in the way I say sound, but it doesn't quite sound like how the people I talk with, how it's talked about in contemporary times. There's people that I just talked with at Revoice like last week or a couple days ago. Um, yeah, and sort of it's not touching the contemporary threads of the conversation as well, what I see. So it looks more like a sort of intellectualist. I read a couple articles and this is what I think, which can be fine. But yeah, still missing, I think, a lot. That's what I'm trying to understand. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Hmm.
I know I know he's talked with some people, but yeah, I still feel like it's missing.
Yeah, I think he mentioned, and I think he mentioned that there's some article or some data coming out from Fairfield University, hopefully, that maybe features some
Hmm.
data
Yeah.
from folks who are in celibate partnerships. But I think a
Hmm.
critique that I've heard you levy against the previous version of the article is that
Hmm.
Peter's analysis of celibate partnerships feels very focused on the West and not really exploring, you know, Eastern Orthodox or Ethiopian Orthodox, or just like
Yeah.
experiences of covenant brotherhood, covenant siblinghood, et cetera, outside of the context of the
Hmm.
Western Church. Is that right?
100%. Yeah. So that's also a major critique.
Okay.
Yes. That I mentioned before. And I still feel that when I look at it now. And you can't, in my opinion, from someone who thinks about this topic, you can't talk about this topic unless you engage the East and the larger church, like the Ethiopians, for example, because assuming you think that the other types of same-sex kinship are relevant to this conversation, which I happen to, I think in reality it is because we actually talk about them in these people who talk about this topic. So, yeah, that's another critique I would have as well. Yeah, do you guys have any other thoughts on critiques of the article?
I think I do. One of one of the things that I challenged Peter on as he was writing the article um,
Hmm.
was, and I talked about this strength had an asterisk on it. When he gets to talking about the
Yeah.
fairness of approaches to romance for straight Christians and queer
Hmm.
Christians, it seemed like he was more concerned with sort of just creating a level playing field for straight Christians and queer Christians. But it seems to me like the kind of free for all romance that exists in like the straight Christian culture is actually not good for straight Christians. So the idea of like inviting queer people into that culture or just banning all of it for everybody, those don't seem like our only two options. The third option would be um, that straight Christians have a kind of approach to romance that's bounded by the discernment of vocation. So, like, we're not just entering into
Hmm.
romantic relationship just because they're fun, but we only enter into romantic relationships or engage in romantic relationships for the purpose of discerning, might this become a covenant siblinghood? Might this become a marriage? Might this become like a celibate partnership or something like that? And the benefit that exists in the like straight world right now is that there is a vocation to discern on the other side of romance, which is marriage, right? But we're trying to, I think a lot of the conversations around celibate partnership inside B right now are trying to build out a positive vocation of same-sex love that this sort of dating slash discernment process might allow
Mhm.
people to decide, yeah, I do think I'm called to this positive, holy vocation of same-sex love with this other person that I sort of am sensing this like connection with, or I'm not called to that positive vocation of same-sex love with this person. But at the end of the day, there still remains a need for developing a positive account of same-sex love so that if we
Mhm.
decide that we want to leave space for same-sex dating or discernment through romance, and that there ought to be some kind of like fair other approach for queer people who are also engaging romance, that there is some vocation that like bounds their entrance into romantic relationships, if that makes it. Like, I don't think any of us thinks that like romantic relationships are good in their own right. They have to be oriented towards some faithful, committed, holy endeavor.
Mhm.
And it
Yeah.
seems to me that right
Mhm.
now inside B, people are trying to figure out the contours of that holy, faithful, committed endeavor for folks who are
Mhm.
engaging with
Mhm.
same-sex love. So
I
yeah,
agree. I agree with that. Can I make another critique?
sure, that's what we're doing, I guess.
He says, and that we are doing that. In the third footnote, he talks about how Christians appeal to examples of spiritual, he calls it spiritual friendship, quote unquote, such as Ruth and Naomi, David and Jonathan, Jesus and John, or Paul and Timothy as support for celibate partnerships. Okay, let's start with this first sentence. Then we go to the other critiques in the other sentence. I don't, I don't, I don't personally think of these as spiritual friendships. I think David and Jonathan is a pretty clear covenant brotherhood, and that's the only way I've ever been taught about it. And that's using spiritual friendships as an umbrella term, which is possible. But I'm just saying, maybe I want to critique the categories. I don't understand how he's categorizing these things. I also have to note, Paul and Timothy were in the liturgical traditions of covenant brotherhood in the East. Paul and Timothy and the other apostles often made shown up in these covenant siblingshoods or brotherhoods as exemplars of this covenant brotherhood thing they're trying to draw on. They weren't covenant brothers, we don't know, but just a type of same-sex love. And then Ruth and Naomi, they also make a covenant. John and Jesus, I don't know, maybe spiritual friendship, but basically, I think there's category confusion here. Um, and we, me and others will appeal to them as support for celibate partnerships. And he does not, he says, I do not think they are the closest analogy for the partnerships considered here, which I agree from. I agree. The biblical friendships were not romantic. Well, how do you define romance? Question mark. Maybe, maybe not. They were not exclusive in marriage-like sense. Well, we don't necessarily always know that.
And the
Yeah.
exclusivity that belongs to marriage is sexual fidelity.
Yes.
There we don't what we modernly often say, oh, you share a kitchen only with your marriage partner and your kid,
Mm,
like well, intergenerational homes, like the
yeah.
actual things that are exclusive to marriage are just this, as it says in I think Titus, like honor the marriage bed. It is
Hmm.
that sexual relationship. So that actually we do know that these relationships honor the exclusivity of marriage and any other forms of exclusivity and different ways that their lives order
Yeah, we
around
don't
each
know
other.
that. Yeah.
We don't know case to case what that actually looked like.
We don't know. They said did not prevent other deep friendships or marriage. We don't know. Maybe David and Jonathan thought they were each other's closest friends and they didn't want someone at that same level. That's very possible. We don't know enough to say
Yeah,
that.
when David,
Also,
adopted Jonathan's kid, did that practically
mm,
be like keep him from wanting to extend that kind of familial bond to someone else? Um,
mm.
we don't know.
And they said they do not appear to have functioned as paired celibate households ordered towards mutual economic and practical support. I mean, I mean, Ruth and Naomi maybe.
For a time.
Like I don't. yeah, for a time. And then he says, basically, spiritual betrothal is the closest comparison, which is jump back to my previous critique. I don't know if that's the case. Like, I might not say that, but it says I don't think that. It makes me kind of think in a different metaphoric galaxy about these relationships, I think. And I think there are distinctions. And I definitely think there are distinctions. I think we have to have good categories for how we define the distinctions. But I'm not sure if what he's providing here is that helpful of a way of categorizing them. I also have to say, I don't, he says that these are not the closest analogies for the partnerships considered here, which I might likely agree with. But that's not what we're doing in the contemporary discussions, in my opinion. We're using these as seeds of examples of same-sex love, and then also comparing them through similar instantiations throughout the life of the church, the past 2 millennia, and then talking about them over time. These are like historically developing things. We don't need an exact, I don't feel like I need an exact replica of that in the scriptures for it to be legitimate Christian kinship form. So, I mean, yeah, that's an important thing for me, how we describe what is allowable and how we can think about these forms over, like, these forms. Do we need direct biblical examples? I don't think we do, but some people really want that at the same time, I recognize.
I think
But I think it's enough that we have examples of same-sex love that give us kind of foundations for the work that we're doing.
returning
in contemporary
to
times.
Ruth Martin's comment where she talks about the side B creativity that happens within limits and how we're
Mhm.
trying to be witnesses of the new creation in our current context. I think it seems Peter's trying to like orient himself out of like, okay, what's a template, a specific template, and whether just for like kind of reasoning purposes to help people build something up, versus what I see in UTJ is like, how can we draw from different templates and say, oh, out of the inspiration of the covenant brotherhood of David and Jonathan, which was not a celibate partnership because they each were married and had their own kids, but that can yet still be an inspiration for a different kind of relationship. It can have its
And that's how human beings actually work. Like, they often draw on key ideas from one form and then extend it to another form.
which even happens within Christian marriage ceremonies. There's so many
Of
different
course, yeah.
scripture verses that are being used to talk about love within the church.
Mhm.
Maybe it'll come to me later. There's one verse that's almost ironic that it's often used in marriage ceremonies, given what it's actually
Mhm.
talking about. But just the exemplary description of love, marriages are drawing from that and incorporating into their vision of what they want their marriage to be about.
I think you might be talking about 1 Corinthians
and-
13, probably. This 1 Corinthians 13 is
That's
actually
it.
written about love, love in the community of the church, but it's used to talk about this particular coupledom in the marriage ceremony. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt though.
Mm-hmm. Is that just the
you
love is
just say
patient,
it?
love is kind?
Yeah, that's right.
That's definitely one of them. There's one that I think is even more ironic, but I'll see if I can find to it. Anyways, but just noting this kind of felt difference of like tight rationality of like, whereas I'm very free to talk about like, oh, I think it's really beautiful for a covenant brotherhood or celibate partnership to think of if they build a household together and for them to think about it as a monastery of two, because they're like, oh, we're trying to
Mhm.
cultivate the presence of God in our lives and for any visitors who come into our home. And they're not a actual monastery with an abbot and a whatever. But in the spirit of a monastery, that gives them kind of a spiritual compass or direction of what they're doing, what they're about. And I think Pieter Valk is trying to orient around like more like, oh, this is a spiritual betrothal, or this is this, and a tighter mapping system that I don't think, yeah, as you said, that's just not what we do. We're constantly having to build in new contexts, and I think that's some of the creativity that we have.
Monasticism itself is an excellent example of that itself, right? The scriptures don't directly talk about what we now consider monasticism. The principles of the monastic life are presented, and then they became, over time, developed into particular social forms, which tempted to walk in the path of those principles. It's kind of like the same way for me, where we have examples of same-sex love, and some of them are pretty direct, like covenant brotherhood still exists, and it's similar to David and Jonathan's, probably in lots of ways. We don't know that much about theirs, but we know a few things. But then celibate partnerships I think are drawing on, again, certain principles of these different types of same-sex love, and then moving to making the social form from those principles that are based on them, but they're not. They also grow beyond them, like a tree grows beyond a seed. It's kind of like that.
I found the verse. This is one I think that's even more ironic because, yeah, most of the scriptures are talking about kind of the love within the church community, but specifically Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12 is quoted. That's the two are better than one. They have a return for their labor. If one falls down, the other can pick them up. If two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Especially in like the marriage context, it's like, oh yeah, the marriage bed. Two are like keeping each other warm in bed. But the context of that, dang it, where'd it go? Oh man, what translation? Basically, it's basically talking about friendship, actually. It's like, oh, there was a man who was all alone. He didn't have like, oh yeah, verse 8. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. So it's just, anyways, I think ironic, this verse that's used in marriage ceremony that's actually talking about a man with either a son as this kind of close companion and partner or a brother, who's for the same purposes. Anyways, all that to say, we're constantly building upon different inspirations, and in some ways that's just what we're trying to do with, say, that like celibate partnerships are not we're not building primarily off of like the marriage metaphor of scriptures. We're building off of, I was just saying that the celibate partnerships, what we're arguing for is not some quasi-marriage thing, and we're not primarily drawing from the text in scriptures regarding marriage, but we're actually looking at texts like these in Ecclesiastes 4 that are talking about, brotherhood, about companionship, about friendship, and wanting to build possibilities for Christians to have flourishing companionship in life that's not just built upon the marriage model. And belongs, as you said in the beginning, to a tapestry of relationships and the different ways that we support one another and reflect just the solidarity of Christ's body, that we really are here for each other, and that it's going to be expressed in different levels of intimacy and commitment. And I hope people have lots of, a certain sense of freedom to, with wisdom, with care, with all, prudence, all these things, which I do think that celibate partnerships require more prudence in some ways than marriage. But
could we think through this idea of celibate partnerships just as an accommodation for like a time, like a temporary accommodation?
Well, I think that's the gist of what we were saying, is that we just disagree with that. But yeah, what do you want to think more about it?
I know we disagree, but is there some way to articulate that disagreement more strongly? Like, why would we say we disagree with that? Is it because we think we see proof of, see proof in the historical record and in contemporary times that these sort of relationships actually cause flourishing, can produce flourishing, even if they weren't necessarily that common in the past, or they're not common in the present? How would we talk about that?
I think,
or is it just a different historical narration?
One reason,
like a different narration.
TJ, who's your favorite two Ethiopian women?
It's Olata Petros and Ahita Christos.
So their friendship both came about in the midst of community. They were part of a monastic order of sorts.
Monastic order, yeah.
But then it led to the multiplication of more communities. And so I think just at a very basic level, it's not an either or kind of situation here. There's actually a mutual life-givingness, a mutual synergy that can happen between deep committed friendship and communal life. Not to say that, again, that committed friendships always happen, that have to happen within like monastic reality. I know, kind of like David and Jonathan, there's versions where they're happening among married people and their families. But just, I think those two examples can show like, wow, crazy commitment and intimacy, both of celibate varieties, both of people who are have separate marriages, um, and that the partnership, the commitment, is happening in that context in a way that's life-giving to their other kinship relationships, to the communities and households that they're committed to. And so just that in this, I like that Christians should be able to, we should be thinking about ethical accommodations given the complexity of our world and our lives. But this just seems like not the place for it.
Yeah, I also think that. Oh, sorry, TJ, you were
No, what do
muted.
you
Go.
think, Tyler? I'm asking,
Well,
what do you think? Yeah.
got it. I was just gonna say, to me, it seems like just throughout too many parts of history, like over the course of millennia, there have been like same-sex relational pairs, and not even in the sexual sense. I mean, in the just like friendship, covenant, brother, like they're just like all these different examples. Like even in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, there were pairs of friends that were known known by each other. Like you wouldn't see one without the other. Or like David and Jonathan, Ruth, Naomi, and we could have conversations about those particular examples. But I basically what I'm trying to say is I see a lot of data about this kind of paired same-sex relationship that's not sexual, and it sort of continues to pop up globally and across history. And the continuity of that kind of relationship over time. I mean, even a Adelpha poesis, like you got various saints who are like trying to be buried together, and to our best understanding, in chastity. And so it just seems like there's too much data to not try to develop a positive account of same-sex love that like bears that form, because it just keeps showing up throughout history. And so accommodation doesn't seem like it, like, I just can't, I find it hard to see how the development of richer communal bonds in the body of Christ would negate the need for developing a positive account. Why that form of relationship continues to pop up both in secular, worldly, pagan, and Christian communities.
Was he just making the judgment because he personally feels the risk threshold is so much more for these rather than monastic? Even though, I mean, I'm just curious. Like, is it kind of a risk threshold, like assumption that he's making, which might be true, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pretend like I can read Peter's mind at all. Some of the conversations that we had, he seemed like particularly concerned about what he calls marriage replacement celibate partnerships. So this idea of like queer people getting together and being like, well, we can't get married, but like we can have celibate partnership, and that's like a good consolation prize. Like, I think he has some really deep-rooted suspicions about the long-term sustainability of a model that is essentially marriage, just minus sex. That is sort of like trying to draw on all of the same cultural tropes of marriage, but it's just between two queer people who are not having sex with each other. I don't think that's I was a little bit confused about why he kept saying marriage replacement celibate partnership. And I'm sure that there are queer people who are interested in celibate partnership, for that reason. I just think from lots of the conversations that I've been having with people about celibate partnership, they're not thinking about it as like this marriage replacement thing. They're thinking about it as this like completely other thing that actually is like sort of designed for the cultivation and development and sanctification of same-sex love. And marriage like isn't for that. Like that's not
hmm
what God gave marriage for.
I have a hot take. I it's I I don't. It's hard for me to see that marriage replacement as that problematic in the first phase of a relationship because, I mean, a lot of people. This is how I think about it. A lot of people do want life partners. Marriage is the main form they have for what life partners look like in society. And so they're saying, oh, I would like a life partner. I know what God commands around sexual chastity and holiness regarding the sexual aspect of the human person. And so I am not going to be in a side relationship. And thus, I would also like to see a life partner. And celibate partnership is one way to have that, and probably the most prominent way. And I, it's hard for me to feel that bad if that's the rationale, even if I don't think it's ideal, because I kind of assume over time they'll, wasn't my hope at least, over time they would move into that relationship and then uncover, oh, over time I'm learning that this is intersects with marriage in some ways, but it's also different. And I'm really fine for that growth over time in the same way. Or by analogy, if we think of a marriage, when our young friends get married, sometimes, like if they're young men, at least some of the young men I know, they seem to have got married mostly for sexual engagement and having sexual aspect to a relationship in a way that would be chaste rather than unchastity. But they also learn over time, marriage is more than just this sexual relationship, but it's also caring for another in a household, building a household together, taking care of kids, orienting our life of our household towards the church, to the ways of the living God. But it's like this progression. So I'll have to say, I'm trying to say it's hard for me to have much fear of this marriage replacement, as long as that's not the end. But if it's part of the process, I don't
I think
have a
my
problem
one
with it, really.
qualifier, like asterisk, I'd put to that,
Mhm.
TJ, because I think I agree that we can put like too high of demands on side B
Mhm.
people and not where
Yeah.
and not give people the time to like grow their kind of the thoughtfulness around this.
Mhm.
Is that I think according to God's design, uh, sex in marriage, where this what can seem like, oh, it's just going to be this like self-seeking like uh love that's just shared between two people, it's just centered on each other, the fruits of
Mhm.
procreation and the longing to like have children naturally are
Mhm.
drawing that love outside of themselves,
Mhm.
to others, to their children, to the generations, to their community. And so there's kind of a kingdom, like kingdom discipleship built ideally like into the form of marriage,
Mhm.
in a way that I think might require more intentional discipleship for celibate partnerships to not turn into a kind of like live your best life now. We're going to be like a high, you know, yeah, in a sense, like this hedonistic gay couple who just like has their nice
Mhm.
posh life. They care for each other. They build up wealth. They've increasing the sizes of their barns, and it's all just for
Yeah.
themselves. Um,
Yeah.
like there's a way that
Mhm.
marriage naturally pushes against that self-centerednism, with children,
Mhm.
that a celibate relationship or even just
May not.
may not.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
I think that
Yeah, that makes
hopefully the
sense.
celibacy
Mhm.
itself is drawing them back towards God, and there's some of those spiritual built-in patterns that are saying, "Oh God, what are the fruits that you want in your kingdom?" So I
Mhm.
don't think it's completely absent. I think the celibacy has its own seedbed of fruitfulness. Um,
Can I share one more thought? And I really want to hear what Tyler has to say, because Tyler, you have great thoughts on this. I wanted to say that I have to admit my own position on this, that this topic we're talking about, these non-celibate marriage, this category, I'm sorry, non-marriage replacement, celibate partnerships, this category. I I'm I often feel like side B people have been repressed by society, which says your love, your sexuality has nothing good to it, or some variant thereof. So I'm often more generous for, you might say, eros, this sort of desirous love, for side B people to be expressing that. And that often produces an interest in expressing it towards another partner, a partner, like having someone who chose you and you chose them. And I want to be pretty generous with side B people because we've often been under such tight restrictions. It's been like we've been caged, and then we're not having a way to channel that desire, that energy in a way. So I'm pretty open to be generous to that, and that may look more like marriage. And that's why I don't. It's hard for me to think that this anti-marriage replacement celibate partnership is like that important to me as a person. Like why? Like I'd be like, who cares? We know it's not marriage. It's just it feels a similar niche in a person's life, kind of, and that's fine. And I don't basically don't feel bad about it. But Tyler, what do you think? I want to hear your thoughts, all of them.
Yeah, maybe my counterpoint and maybe something that I could imagine Peter also echoing is just that
Mhm.
like marriage does have this sort of unique role as a like specific form of kinship which was like ordained and given by God before the fall, you know? And
Yeah.
so it is a structure given by God that ought to be honored because it tells a particular story. And we should be very cautious about relationships that we would develop as human beings that seek to imitate marriage because like marriage is a particular structure and it's very easy to make parodies of marriage or like to try to craft relationships that follow our own desires on what marriage should look like or something like that.
Mhm.
That's why it feels really important to me that celibate partnership express a meaningfully different structure than what marriage is, because I don't think it makes sense to try to create something that's like marriage, kind of at its core, but like different, because marriage is a very specific thing as given by God to tell a very specific story. And I happen to think that like same sex love is like given by God to tell a different story. I mean, something that still says something about God, but like it's not the story that marriage precisely is trying to tell.
Yeah, understood. For me, often the fact that one is sexually involved and one is celibate is pretty prominent enough to close enough for me to make a very prominent distinction. But I encountered some people in my life who well, they want more than that. But then I have to ask, well, what do you want more than that? Like, and I don't think a opposite sex relationship is the same as the same sex. I think there's like different energies, different relationship. It's different. I also think you can talk about a theological metaphor like Christ and his church that I don't think same sex relationships have. But then I I don't I start drawing a blank on what else needs to be different. And I don't know if you guys have any thoughts, but it sometimes comes up in my life. Like I feel like the sex, the thing about difference between not having sex, which I think is prominent, people care about that. The difference in theological metaphor where this might or marriage might represent Christ and his church and kind of that tradition. And then this connection between the male and the female, which marriage has. All three of those I think are distinctly different. And then for me, that's essentially basically enough. Like that's enough of a difference for me not to feel that bad. But if celibate partnerships look like marriage, like cohabiting in a similar house, building a household together, sharing resources, um, like loving them, making a covenant, blah blah blah. I don't have the need for more differentiation. What do you guys think about that? Maybe that's a hot take, but
Well,
I do think that's how I
I mean,
usually
I just
approach
think
it.
that for
Hmm.
me, that episode with Catherine about the history of romance in the West just really helped me
Hmm.
think through like how culturally bound some of our associations are for what marriage and is today.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, that were so a lot of those things are like, well, what's the big deal if these kind of map onto our modern conceptions of marriage, knowing that 300 years ago those weren't the same things that people mapped onto marriage. Um,
Hmm.
and so that's why I just focus on the like marriage is about sexual fidelity, and then everything else is like what are the pragmatics that lead to a more flourishing family life, and that involves a lot of the things that we modernly expect about sharing a household. How we define that sharing, but the emotional, social, spiritual integration that we desire. Like I think those are
Hmm.
good things that support a flourishing family life, but they're not they're things that we're bringing into this loving covenantal relationship. They're not, I think, things that only belong within the domain of marriage.
Hmm. Yeah, I get that. Tyler, what do you think? Like, how else would you distinguish marriage from kind of what we might anticipate celibate partnership to be? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd have to think about it more, I think. It
Mhm.
just, I mean, I'm somewhat operating off of instinct here. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking, it's like
Yeah.
not only do we have an obligation as Christians to, like, if we enter into marriage, that the center of why we enter into marriage is to reflect the relationship between Christ and the church, but
Hmm.
also, like, when we enter into marriages, that, like, says something to the watching world about what we think marriage is about, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
so I think I have a sort of internal skepticism about, like, if you got two people in a celibate partnership and they're trying to explain to another person, maybe somebody outside of the church, a queer person that they run into at the local queer bar or something. Well, what's a celibate partnership? Oh, it's like marriage without the sex. Like, that seems like an insufficient and potentially dangerous kind of way of explaining what
Mm-hmm.
celibate partnership is, um, as a witness to the people outside of the
Yeah.
church. I think there needs to be
Right.
a, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
But then I want to ask you, does that mean that that definition is not, there's some truth to it, and you might say it in some circles, but you would not say it when you're trying to witness? Or would you say that's 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 probably not ever, basically ever a helpful way to think about it in some, yeah. I'm just curious how you think about that.
I mean, I just think that I don't think that marriage is the right reference point for it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
In
I
the
think
sense that
that,
people, sorry to cut you off, Tyler, of just like, we actually are acknowledging that our society doesn't actually have the right ideas about marriage. Um,
right,
and
or
so
kinship, right? No, go ahead.
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
just that we're actually, rather than building off of their conception of marriage, we kind of need to be doing a separate developmental work to be like, actually, here's the beauties of friendship and, brotherhood and sisterhood. And here's the things about what marriage is. They might actually ask, well, what's the difference between marriage? And we're like, well, actually, marriage we see as Christ in the church, and it carries all this other theological significance, the connection between the other, which represents the connection between heaven and earth. And that's not what's present in my relationship.
Yeah, there's other things that are present in this type of relationship, not that particular thing. Yeah. Go ahead, Tyler.
To say, oh, it's like marriage without sex, it feels to me to kind of center this relationship. That's an
Mm-hmm.
important relationship, but I don't think it should occupy the sort of central position of how kinship operates in society.
Yeah.
There are other models of kinship than marriage, and I think that to define celibate partnership in reference to marriage, sort of structurally, like, it does a disservice to all the other kinds of kinship that ought to be highlighted as we move into a world that's kind of defined by Jesus being like, who is my mother, my brother, my sisters? It's like those who do the will of
Mm-hmm.
my Father. Like, marriage is just
Mm-hmm.
not central in that kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, I get
It's not
that.
the reference point for kinship in that
Yeah, I get
kingdom, I
that.
think.
The complexity though is it'd be like some engaging ideas of nature versus grace or something. The complexity is that marriage is a very common human relationship.
Right.
And the one that people often have a reference for, even like at least in the contemporary world. So for example, when I talk to celibate partners in the current world in the US, they sometimes you'll ask them like, oh, so let's say there's two men who are in a celibate partnership. So he's like your husband, right? And it's like, no, we think of it very differently. But sometimes they might say, yeah, I guess if they have, depending on who they're talking to, if they're just trying to get through something, they might just say like, yeah, I guess. And it's not right. It's not precisely wrong though, too, based on what the person is asking about. It's kind of this in between thing. And so I'm trying to figure out how is it so wrong to say marriage without the sex is a first points to try to get the point across, but then say, oh, but actually, you might think of it like this, but actually there's more, and it's this and that. It's not like marriage, but we just use it as a metaphor to try to communicate with you right now. So you can take the first step, up the stairs to understand what the thing is. I mean, yeah, I'm just curious how you guys think of that. And this enters more into the practical, maybe missiological nature of trying to talk about this with a general audience who, I mean, the West are inheritors of our Christian marriage form to a large extent, even though they've obviously, in broad terms, they've gone off the rails. But our forms are part of their forms too. So, yeah, I don't know.
These are all good questions. These are all good questions, and to Peter's credit, I think he notes at the end of his article that we need. What does he say? He said we need better distinctions between sexual activity, erotic behavior, romance, affection, attachment, householding, public commitment, legal partnership, and spiritual kinship. We need pastors, theologians, historians, counselors, and celibate Christians at the same table. We need more research into actual fruit of these partnerships, including whether they sometimes fail, but also whether they deepen faith, sustain chastity, reduce loneliness, and keep people connected to the church, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, he's highlighting there's a need for further research. There's a need for further work to, like, build out these categories of, like, what is romance? What is eros? How is celibate partnership different from marriage? And I totally agree with that. I do think that there's a need for, like, just a lot more work. But that's, I mean, I guess that's a part of the reason why I was a little disappointed that he sort of felt the need to make a judgment that celibate partnerships ought to operate as an accommodation rather than there being a positive account of same-sex love. Because it's like, well, if we're missing all this data, why are we making
how do you make such a big judgment? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know why we feel the pressure to put limits on, like, siblinghood and friendship, and not imagine that it can have quite a profound role in people's lives. Yes.
Can I jump off of what Tyler Parker said? Tyler said. We're talking with our friend Joel Carini, this Presbyterian philosopher who's our friend, and he was once talking about how he does, he has kind of a pastoral ministry and he kind of connects with pastoral people and scholarly people, and how pastors always feel this need to try to make immediate judgments, where the scholars and the academics and the historians and stuff usually be like, okay, like we just need to get some more data and, like, talk about this for a longer time. And I kind of felt like that with Peter, where you're talking about he felt this need to make such a quick judgment, an evaluation judgment, rather than, as you said, let the data keep flowing. They're still being discerned. People are working on new works on these things. Some of the relationships are just starting. But I kind of wonder if that is actually a worse posture to make such a drastic judgment before, as you said, before all these things are come. But it seems like what oftentimes pastors seem to want, because they feel like, I need a response now. And maybe not all of them, but it seems like a lot of them. So.
Yeah, and I definitely think that Equip's work, like this is Peter's organization, Equip. It's primarily working with pastors and particularly working with conservative churches. So I definitely applaud Peter for trying to provide resources that allow conservative churches to make space that allows them to, like, care for and offer some vision and hope for the queer people in their congregations. However, I sort of just hope that pastors can become more comfortable with, like, ambiguity and, like, the discomfort of, like, not coming to just super easy answers. Because, like, we worship an utterly transcendent God. Every single one of us is going to, like, arrive at Judgment Day and be theologically wrong about something, because we don't know everything that there is to know about an infinite God. And so, like, if we're gonna act like we need to have easy answers for questions. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like I work in ministry, so I'm aware of the like need for answers. Like I'm aware of the
Yeah,
felt need
definitely.
for answers. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, like the only answers that we have are the ones that are revealed to us through Christ or through the scripture, and then everything else is like wisdom. And like it's super important to not respond out of anxiety to some of these really hard questions that are being posed to us because God is not anxious about these questions. And so if the chief responsibility of a pastor is to image God to his flock, then like it's super important to not like rush these things, and to
Hmm.
be able to like respond to some of these questions without anxiety or a sense of hurry.
Yeah, I'm also I get worried if our audience can warp what we write sometimes. You know what I mean? Because it's kind of a mutual endeavor. And I think I'm not saying Peter does this, but I think we always have to ask ourselves, if my audience is conservative people, how am I limiting what I might actually think to respond to them more? And that can be good sometimes, but I also think it can be a warping project or warping aspect of the project as well.
I don't know how much longer we're gonna chat about it, but I was curious, like maybe if we had like constructive feedback or something, like what what are the things that we might want to see Equip or Peter engage with, like provide an article that we think might give a better account of celibate partnership.
I mean, building off of, I think you read his line where he's like, we need theologians and pastors to be doing more thinking about, the shapes of households and all these different kind of elements of life and start to disentangle them and think through them. Um, I just love to see Peter be doing some more of his good writing and helping people do that disentanglement. Um, and I know he especially like, he has, background in psychology or therapy and thinking around the psychological facets of those needs that we have in our life, and um, just really mapping the wide varieties of ways that those needs can be met. And I think those are quickly also blessings for married people too when we start to do that work, because people stop trying to like have all their needs met in marriage, and it's like, oh, what if my spouse is emotionally unavailable? Do I divorce them? You know, must that lead to an affair if I develop an emotional connection with someone else? Um, and anyways, I would love to see him provide more resources that bless not just um, celibate people, but also married people. Yeah.
Oh, I think
But
I'd like to
I,
see. Oh, go
sorry,
ahead.
this is just an anecdote. Um, Someone asked me, would when I'm taking my upcoming celibacy vow, if I'm also like swearing off the celibate partnerships or something. And I mean, people can make technically a vow towards, almost anything. That's not sinful, but it seemed like kind of odd to me of like, why would I like a certain type of friendship or brotherhood? Why would that be a part of my vow of celibacy? That it would be exclusive of that. Um, so I think that still just maps onto people have this certain sense that celibacy is focused on disconnection, rather than kingdom connection. Again, there's people who are oriented towards being like a hermit or something, but just an anecdote.
Yeah. I mean, I do get the sense that people, because I've heard this from like several side B people, people get the sense that celibacy does mean giving up romance, or at the very least, um, in First Corinthians chapter 7, Paul talks about how a husband is anxious for his wife and like pleasing his wife and things like that, and that celibacy seems to be put in opposition to those anxieties. So I would imagine that that's why people think that celibacy involves giving up
And Paul
romance
trades
or
those
giving up.
anxieties for his anxieties towards like the whole Church of Corinth.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Thank you for like those are the scriptures and ideas that we're wrestling through.
That's right. Um, were you gonna say something else, David Frank? Okay. I think for me, and hopefully TG, I'm not stealing your thunder. I definitely want to. I would love to see more of an engagement with like global data or historical data on covenant, siblinghood, um, adelphopoiesis,
Mm-hmm.
like romantic friendships from the sort of secular
Mm-hmm.
world. I mean, but there aren't. I mean, I talked to people about this particular book that I picked up from a used bookstore in Chicago once upon a time, but it's called The Overflowing of Friendship, by a guy named Richard Godbeer, and it's just about like these kinds of romantic, uh, or I don't know what you call them. Maybe you call them like emotionally charged friendships, in the 17 and 1800s. And some of the examples that they use are talking about sort of non-religious people, but like there's entire chapters on the prevalence of this kind of friendship within Christian communities. And I think that that's just like important data to try to wrestle with as we try to understand what could celibate partnership be, but even more so than what could celibate partnership be, just like what could holy chaste same-sex love look like, because I think that that is kind of at the center of all of these conversations, is that question.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with you just said, Tyler. I'm gonna add also that I started to see this in this article, this New Vision version. I wish he would participate more in the deconstruction of romance. Like I think he alludes to that it's complicated, da da da, which is great, but I would want to talk about that more. Um, I wish in any article that I would write about this, I would talk about that a lot more, actually. That romance is probably a less helpful category, just based on how people use it or what they think it means. Um, and I also wish beyond the historical and geographical data that you would talk directly to more people in contemporary times. I know he has talked to some people, but I think there's more people to talk with. And I just think more people who are currently in would be helpful. And it's not just a fly-by conversation like, oh, we talked for 30 minutes. Okay, bye. I learned the things. But actually having a relationship over time, which can provide experience and knowledge and wisdom over time. So, yeah. I mean, yeah. The people I know who reviewed this document, at that point, I only knew one who was in a celibate partnership, and the others I knew weren't. So, just been good to talk to more people as well.
And I would be very curious to know if Peter feels like there's more to learn about celibate partnerships, or if he feels like
Mhm. Like
he's
he got it
seen
enough.
enough.
He's seen enough. He might. I think there's more to say.
Yeah, I mean,
I think so too.
given how much he is
Yeah.
trying to write for a specific audience,
Mhm.
I'm guessing he does have a lot more thoughts. And he was just really focusing on, he thought this was like a really powerful argument for his audiences. And yeah, so we'll see. More conversations to come.
Mhm.
Okay, well, let's end it here.
Love it.
Nice.
Thanks for joining
Everybody,
Kinship Lab number 4.
we got. That's right. Yeah, and remember to follow us on Substack, because we want to hear your opinions about the article. Hopefully, we can include the article in the show notes, so that you can have a listen, and then on Substack you can let us know what you thought about the article or what you thought about our pushback.
Yeah,
Um,
we'd really love to hear, like, do you think conservative churches can embrace the possibility of celibate partnerships based more on Peter's accommodation argument, or would they be better suited to develop an expanded imagination for friendship and spiritual siblinghood? How do you think different forms of partnership compete or complement investments into serving community or other facets of pursuing God? And I'd also be curious in hearing from y'all of, like, what are the practical needs that people have, regardless of whether they're celibate or not, that should really be considered and not just left to like the whims of chance, but people should be, thinking about the relationships that they're getting those from. So those questions and any other thoughts you have, we'd love to hear.
we can't wait to think with you on the next episode of Kinship Lab. But for now, goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.